60 ill or wounded Cuban prisoners. A hushed crowd of Cuban exiles, as well as ambulances and medical teams, await the arrival of the liberation plane from Havana, slightly delayed because of the reluctance of some of the men to leave their comrades behind. The men are erect and proud as they disembark, though many of them are in great pain from wounds contracted in the doomed invasion at the Bay of Pigs almost exactly a year ago. Others suffer from illnesses resulting from their imprisonment. A $2.5 million ransom.
Hi guys! For today's video, I will explain about Cuban immigration to the United States. I hope you guys learn more about it. And if you're ready, let's get started!
So, the Cuban immigration to the US began in an era of peaceful coexistence between the two nations. In the latter part of the 19th century, workers moved freely between Florida and the island, and the trade in sugar, coffee, and tobacco was lucrative. Cigar companies soon began relocating from Cuba to avoid tariffs and trade regulations, and Cubans came by the thousands to work in the factories. Soon, the towns of Key West and Raw City were the capital of tobacco-scented empire, and also became the center of new Cuban enclaves. Even as these communities grew, Cuban workers continued to shuttle across the Straits of Florida as work allowed. At the beginning of the 20th century, between 50,000 and 100,000 Cubans moved between Havana, Tampa, and Key West every year. At the same time, some Cubans fled political persecution, including Jose Marti, the father of Cuban independence, who worked as a writer in New York City while organizing his liberation forces. After the Spanish-American War, through the early 20th century, the U.S. maintained a high level of interest in Cuban affairs, and U.S. businesses increased their investment in Cuban enterprises. Meanwhile, as the Cuban government adopted increasingly repressive policies, opposition leaders continued to seek refuge into the U.S. in the 1950s. The harsh regime of Fulgencio Batista brought political resistance to a boiling point, and the number of refugees swelled. When Fidel Castro led his revolutionary army into Havana in January of 1959, he ushered in a new era in Cuban life. He also launched a new era of mass immigration from his country to the United States. In the decades that followed, more than 1 million Cubans would make their way to the US, and thousands more would try and fail. Once the new Cuban government allied itself with the Soviet Union, the US and Cuba became open enemies, and prospective immigrants were at the mercy of international politics. Through the years, as relations between the countries improved or deteriorated, the door of immigration would be opened and closed again and again. As a result, Cubans arrived in the US in several distinct phases, each of which had distinctly different reception. So, the first Cubans were the wealthiest. More than 200,000 of these golden exiles had left Cuba for the US by 1962, when air flights between the two countries were suspended. Between 1965 and 1973, a few flights resumed from Varadero Beach in Cuba, and 300,000 more Cubans who became known as Varaderos seized the opportunity to immigrate. The immigrants of these two phases were welcomed in the US with open arms. It was the peak of the Cold War, and immigrants from Cuba were viewed by many in the US as refugees from a dictatorial regime. The US government opened a Cuban refugee center in Miami and offered medical and financial aid to the new arrivals. In 1966, Congress passed the Cuban American Adjustment Act, which allowed any Cuban who had lived in the US for a year to become permanent resident, a privilege that has never been offered to any immigrant group. The next major immigrant received very different welcome. In 1980, under international pressure, the Cuban government opened the port city of Mariel to any Cuban who wanted to leave for the United States. The Cuban American community mobilized to help, and within days, a massive flotilla of private yachts, merchant ships, and fishing boats arrived in Mariel to bring Cubans to Florida. In the 6 months the port remained open, more than 125,000 Cubans were delivered to the US. These immigrants, known as the Marielitos, were much less affluent than previous generations had been. However, and a few thousand had been incarcerated while in Cuba. As a result, many Marielitos were stigmatized in the US as undesirable elements, and thousands were confined in temporary shelters and federal prisons, some for years. The next part is the largest flux. Within the United States, Cuban population is very highly concentrated, with 77% living in Florida. During the period 2014 to 2018, the next three top states of residency were Texas and New Jersey, with each of them containing 4% of the population, and California for 3%. The top four counties by concentration were all Florida, Miami-Dade, Broward, Hillsborough, and Palm Beach. Together, these counties were about 67% of all Cuban immigrants in the United States. Besides, Cuban immigrants are also highly concentrated in the city. In the 2014 to 2018 period, 63% of Cubans in the United States live in Greater Miami metropolitan area. The Tampa metro area hosted the second largest population, and the Greater New York metro area was a close third, with about 5% of all Cuban immigrants living in each area. The situation in their own country was that the revolution by Fidel Castro in 1959, and under the situation of revolution, they faced the economic crisis. The citizens of Cuba started to lose faith in Fidel Castro, which later led to the Mariel boat lift. It was also during the time of Cold War, when Cuba and the US were enemies. They faced the US embargo, which affected on their foreign trade greatly. Moreover, Cuba didn't have any support from the Soviet Union at the time. Slot asylum at the Venezuelan and proved two incidents happened on May 13 in the 1979, a group of Cubans crashes a bus to Venezuelan embassy to seek asylum, and another one in June 11th. In the same year, the Cuban police opened fire to a group of Cubans trying to enter a Venezuelan embassy, and eventually Castro allowed people to leave country and opened port for them to leave by boat. Next is a video from 1980 when Cuban people were trying to seek asylum in Peruvian embassy.
Quien no tenga sangre revolucionaria, quien no tenga una mente que se adapte a la idea de una revolución, quien no tenga un corazón que se adapte al esfuerzo y al heroísmo de una revolución, no los queremos, no los necesitamos.
Una triste tormenta está azotando sin descansar, pero el sol de tus hijos pronto la calma te hará alcanzar. Cuando salí de Cuba, dejé mi vida, dejé mi...
After 1959, the first wave from 1959 to 1962 has been named the Golden Exile because most refugees came from the upper and middle strata of Cuban society, which is the member of this cohort prefer to describe themselves as historic exiles. The majority were urban, middle-aged, well-educated, light-skinned, and white-collar workers. Most were born in the largest city, particularly Havana. Many fled for political or religious reasons, fearing persecution by the revolutionary government. During the period between 1,600 and 1,700 Cubans arrived in the United States per week on commercial airlines, and the U.S. government admitted approximately 278,100 Cubans. One dramatic episode during this period were Operation Prado Pan, which brought more than 14,000 unaccompanied children to the United States between December 1960 and October 1962. On January 3, 1961, the United States broke diplomatic relations with Cuba. Until then, the U.S. Embassy in Havana and Consulate in Santiago had issued regular visas to those who wished to emigrate. After the rupture in relations, the United States extended visa waivers to Cubans for humanitarian reasons. On arriving in U.S. territory, they could apply for parole and obtain refugee status, claiming they were escaping communist oppression. Most of the refugees remained in Miami, their main port of entry. The Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962 interrupted commercial travel between the two countries. Clandestine migration rose correspondingly, mostly by inner tubes and small makeshift vessels across the Florida Straits. Per U.S. source, about 6,700 boat people arrived in Florida between 1962 and 1965. And next is the second wave, which is the immigration wave or freedom flights, which is diplomatic negotiation between Washington and Havana, resulted in the creation of an air bridge between Varadero and Miami from December 1, 1965 to April 6, 1973, and it became largest and longest refugee resettlement initiative in the U.S. history, with twice daily flights funded by the U.S. government transporting between 3,000 and 4,000 refugees per month, for a total about 260,000 people. By the end of Freedom Flight, the exodus has become more representative of the island population, with the share of blue-collar service worker increasing. Skilled and semi-skilled worker, salespeople, and farmers made up the bulk of immigrants between 1965 and 1973 shift in the refugee flow mirror the impact of revolutionary programs on wider segments of the Cuban population, such as small-scale vendors and artisans. As with their predecessor, the new arrivals settled primarily in Miami, Hialeah, and other cities in South Florida. After the freedom flights ended, Cuban migration failed to trickle nearby. 38,000 Cubans resettled in the United States between 1973 and 1979, arriving primarily from the other countries including Jamaica and Venezuela. Ideological and economic reasons to immigrate became intertwined by the end of 1970s, and Cubans increasingly resemble labor migrants from countries such as Mexico or the Dominican Republic, driven abroad by a desire to improve their living standards. The main difference was that U.S. government categorized Cubans as refugees from communism, which the designation offered them a fast track to legal permanent residence and immediate access to federal safety net benefits, a preferential treatment unlike that afforded to any other immigrant or refugee group, and most of the other as economic. The third wave of Cuban migration took place from Mariel Harbor to Key West in Florida. In 1979, more than 100,000 exiles returned to visit Cuba, familiarizing family members with economic opportunities abroad. Subsequently, in April 1980, more than 10,800 Cubans who wanted to migrate swarmed the Peruvian embassy in Havana. In a reprise of Camarioca, the Cuban government opened the port of Mariel for these who could be picked up by relatives living abroad. When the exiles arrived in Mariel to pick up family members, Cuban officials forced them to also take unrelated persons, some of whom had been inmates in prison or psychiatric hospitals, while others had been identified as prostitutes and homosexuals. The Mariel boat lift brought nearly 124,800 Cubans to Key West. The Marielitos, as they were pejoratively labeled, were primarily young, single, working-class men with little education. Approximately 20% were black or mulatto, compared to just 7% of the Marielitos were common criminals. However, 25% had been imprisoned in Cuba for various reasons, including violating the Cuban law of peligrosidad or dangerous behavior, which include public displays of homosexuality. In Havana, the government branded the refugee as escoria or scum because it considered them antisocial and counter-revolutionary elements. The Mario exodus deepened the rift between old and new immigrants in Miami, where most of the latter group settled. The year of departure from Cuba became symbol of social status within the tight-knit Cuban exile community, with those who left after 1980 receiving public scorn. The fourth wave began during the special period on peacetime, the official euphemism for Cuba's prolonged economic crisis after fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the collapse of Soviet Union in 1991, and subsequent drop in financial support from Cuba. During the first half of the 1990s, Cuba experienced profound economic recession, resulting in plunging living standards, rising social tensions, and unmet demands for political reform. Migratory pressure accumulate rapidly, encompassing broad sector of population. The Cuban government once again turned to immigration to release some of these pressures, allowing anyone who could want to leave the island to do so on August 12, 1994. As slowed down during the 1980s, accelerated during the 1990s. Between 1990 and 1994, some 61 and 200,000 Cubans were admitted to the United States. In addition, about 13 and 600 Cubans on raft arrived between January 1990 and July 1994. The number reached a new post-Mario record in August 1994. By the end of that month, the U.S. Coast Guard had rescued 21 and 300 Cubans near the Florida coast. The so-called Balsero crisis consisted of 30 and 900 Cuban rafters interdicted at sea during the one-month period beginning on August 13, 1994. Since the early 1960s, the U.S. government had welcomed Cubans as refugees fleeing the Castro regime. However, Clinton administration perceived the Balsero crisis as a national security threat that could quickly become another Mario. And the problem they faced due to this large number of Cubans began to arrive in the United States after 1959 Communist Revolution. At first, the elite class arrived as political refugees and supporters of the US-backed regime that Castro's revolution has out, then grew to the middle and lower class. The Cuban population in the United States grew almost sixfold within a decade. Although Cuba limited immigration of its residents, 3 events after 1959 revolution allowed Cubans to exit the island for the United States. The 1980 Mario boat lift brought nearly 125,000 Cubans to Florida. Continued migration by sea to the United States led to the 1995 establishment of the wet foot, dry foot policy. Despite recently resumed sanctions against Cuba and increased deportation of Cuban nationals, the Cuban Adjustment Act remains in effect today.
And next is about the laws. To explain more about the law, there are 2 main specific laws of Cuban immigrants, and the first one is Cuban Adjustment Act or CAA. U.S. federal law in the 2nd of November in 1966 that was enacted with the intent of allowing Cuban native or citizen in the United States to bypass standard immigration rules to more quickly and easily obtain lawful permanent residency, or known as green card. Key among the eligibility requirements is that the individual must reside in the United States for at least 1 year. The acts also apply to non-Cuban and children. The wet foot, dry foot policy is a name given to be a consequence of the 1959 revision of the Cuban Adjustment Act of 1966 that say, essentially that anyone who failed Cuba and got into the United States would be allowed to pursue residency a year later. After talk with the Cuban government, the Clinton administration comes to an agreement with Cuba that it would stop admitting people found at sea. Since then, in what has become known as the wet foot, dry foot policy, a Cuba caught on the water between the two nations would summarily be sent at home or to the third country. One who makes it to shore get a chance to remain in the United States and later would qualify for expedited legal permanent status, and eventually there will be the U.S. citizenship. And moreover, U.S. President Barack Obama ended the initiative in 2017. After that time, Cuban native and citizens were required to seek legal entrance into the United States before being eligible to become permanent resident. Although the Cuban Adjustment Act remained in effect, the change eliminated one of its core components. So, moving on to the most famous Cuban American people, the first one is Jose Canseco. He is a Cuban American former Major League Baseball outfielder and designated hitter. Canseco has admitted using performance enhancing drugs during his player career, and in 2005 he wrote a tale-all book, Juice, Wild Time, Lambton Lloyd, Smash Hit, and How Baseball Got Big, in which he claimed that the vast majority of MLB players use steroids. And after retiring from Major League Baseball, he also competed in boxing and mixed martial arts. And moreover, Canseco is the identical twin brother of former Major League player Ozzie Canseco. And the second one is John Cicada. He is an American singer and songwriter. He was born in Havana, Cuba, and raised in Florida. And he has won 2 album awards and sold 20 million albums since his English language debut in 1992. Moreover, his music fusions funk, soul, pop, and Latin percussion. Cicada also has worked as a songwriter for Gloria Estefan, Jennifer Lopez, Ricky Martin, Mandy, and other performers. And another one is Andy Garcia. He is a Cuban American actor, and he became known in the late 1980s and 1990s. He having appeared in several successful Hollywood films, including The Godfather Part 3, The Untouchable Internal Affair, and When a Man Loves a Woman. And more recently, he has starred in the Ocean 11 and its sequel, Ocean 12 and Ocean 13, and The Lost City. Garcia was nominated for the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor for his role as Winston Mancini in The Godfather Part 3. And next one is Camila Cabello. She was born in the 3rd of March in 1997. She is a Cuban American singer and songwriter. She rose to permanent as a member of the girl group British Fifth Harmony. And while she in this group, she began to establish herself as a solo artist with series of the collaboration, such as Senorita with Shawn Mendes and Batting with Machine Gun Kelly, and the rather reaching number 4 on the US Billboard. And next, Camila left the group in the late 2016, and released several other collaborations, including Hey Ma with Pitbull and J Balvin, and For the Fate of the Furious soundtrack in 2017, and also Crying the Cup. And the last one is Christina Maria. She was born in 29 January in 1948. She is a Cuban-American journalist, television personality, actress, and talk show host of the Spanish language eponymous show, which is El Show de Cristina. And before her television career, she worked for 10 years as editor-in-chief of the Spanish language version of Cosmopolitan magazine, distributed throughout the Latin American.
Ahora, tararán, tatán, llegó el momento de presentarles a la Miss Universo 1996. Ella es la venezolana Alicia Machado. Bienvenida. Bienvenida. Alicia, ¿y esa maquinita de escribir?
No, esta es mi corona.
¿Tu corona?
La traigo en esta cajita para mostrársela a todos ustedes.
Ay, tu corona.
Sí.
¿Cómo no se te ocurrió? Qué original esta mujer y no la trajo puesta, ¿vieron?
No.
¿Cómo es?
Un poquito más ejecutiva con la
Me
corona en la mano.
encanta. Muy
Gracias.
bien. All right. Yo creo que desde que existe el Miss Universo, no han habido tantos chismes en torno a una persona como han habido en torno a ti. ¿Por qué?
No sé qué
Se
tengo
meten
yo.
en todo, se meten con todo. Que si pesas esto, que si pesas lo otro, que si sales con este galán, que si dejas de salir. ¿Por qué? ¿Qué tienes tú que inspiras tanto salero, hija?
No sé qué tengo. Pero yo creo que todos los comentarios en este mundo, y tú lo debes saber más que yo porque tienes más años, sean buenos o sean malos, sean buenos o sean malos, en el fondo son buenos. Y no sé qué tengo, yo creo que quizás mi manera de ser, que soy una persona como me ves, así, tal cual. Y siempre trato de ser con la gente como realmente.
And next one, I will talk about the stereotype of Cuban. And the first one is constantly smoking cigar. The question is, are the Cuban cigars the finest in the world? And yes, would be. Hypothetically look more powerful when smoking cigar, and of course. But that doesn't mean Cubans are always puffing away, and day in and day out. And the second one is, Cuban experts all come to US on a boat, and as you know, it's not true, as Cubans do have planes, and most experts chose this way to leave the country. And there were some desperate situations which were heavily promoted by the media, but this doesn't mean it's the supreme truth. And for the third one is, all Cuban can dance, and this is probably the famous myths about Cuban. In fact, many of the stereotypes surrounding Cuban are related to the country's reputation for music and dance, although only a small number of Cubans can actually dance. Carelessly enough, there are a nickname for Cubans who can dance, and they call Swedes. The origin of this term is not legit. It comes from a story that the Swedes used to have a law that banned any spontaneous dancing, which of course is a common Cuban pastime. And for the next one is, Cuban is dangerous? It's quite the opposite. According to the United Nations Office on Drug and Crime, Cuba is one of the safest countries in the Western Hemisphere, with only Canada and Chile having a lower homicide rate. And for the last one is, when moving abroad, all Cubans come to Miami, and there is indeed a largest community of Cuban people living in Miami, but come to think about it, they are everywhere, such as US, Germany, Spain, Pakistan, Venezuela, for there to come as well. And next is the video about how Miami Cubans react to the stereotype.
Yes.
Okay, now you know what I'm going to ask you to do.
I'm not gonna do that.
We're pretty good dancers. Yeah. We've got the rhythm in us naturally, you know?
No.
Okay.
I can.
I can't.
Salsa.
I can.
I'm the worst
I
salsa
can.
dancer.
He can.
No.
Like we may not have the 1, 2, 3 and la rueda, tú sabes. Like we may not know the steps, but let me tell you, when a Hispanic, and this is not only Cuban, but like when you have that blood and you were raised with that fire of survival, I feel like every dance is a calling. It's like a connection immediately to your roots. Everything may be taken away from us, but we still have our spirit and our soul, and we're going to show it in this moment. Absolutely not. That is truth to the core. Oh my God, I need it like dark with like a splash of leche evaporada.
If I don't drink it and it's already been like 3, I have a headache. Like I have to drink it because now my body craves it. That's why they say coffee is a drug.
It's liquid crack in a cup, and it's just addicting.
There's some bakeries will put, maybe 2 scoops of sugar, but in my house, my mother likes to put 4 or 5.
They're this big, and it's jet fuel. You just drink one, and it's boom. You're back to life. If you have 2, you'll start getting heart palpitations. If you have 3, you'll have an anxiety attack.
No, this is a horrible stereotype.
That is the worst stereotype.
That is.
It is.
Because my parents came by plane.
Okay.
Okay, there is these things that actually fly in the air and bring people. It's incredible. Not all of us know how to swim the 90-meter dash in an hour.
Ay, Dios mío, no. We came here on boat, plane, salsaing, dancing over, like we transported.
I used to get really pissed at that. Oh, you came here on a boat, you're rafter, they'll do the row your boat thing.
Yes, some of us came on boats, tires, whatever floated. Some of us came in Pedro Pan,
And the next topic is how Cuban portrayed in the popular media. And this is how Cuban are portrayed in the popular media. During the time of Maria Boliv, American media portrayed them as criminal because during the time, Castro deported many criminals out of Cuba. And nonetheless, not all of Cubans who came at that time were criminal. Therefore, the several filmmakers implicitly expressed some negative side of Cuban Americans through the film, which is Bad Boy in Part 2. And one of the films that reflect the stereotype of Cuban American, and moreover, the film portrayed the diaspora of Cuban American in Miami, and the film followed Detective Burnett and Lowell investigating the flow of illegal drug going to Miami. And next is the last topic that I will describe is culture. And for the assimilation, many Cuban Americans have assimilated themselves into American culture, which include Cuban influences. And more recently, there has been substantial growth of new Cuban American community in places like Kentucky, North Carolina, Texas, or California. And the latter city now has the second highest percentage of Cuban and Cuban American in the western United States at 1.69% of the population. And Cuban Americans have been really successful in establishing business and developing political in Miami. And Cuban Americans have also contributed to and participated in many areas of American life, including academia, business, acting, political, or literature. In the last 15 years, due to the growth of interest around the world for genealogy, Cuban genealogy has become a major interest for Cuban Americans and a growing segment in the family research industry. This has complemented assimilation by perceiving Cuban and colonial roots while also adopting American culture and value. And next is about religion. Cuban Americans are mostly Roman Catholics, but some Cubans practice African traditional religions, which involved from mixing the Catholic religion with the traditional African religions. Cuban Catholicism was also influenced by the Catholicism practiced by the Canadian people. And however, there are many Protestants with small number of non-religion or tiny community of Jewish and Muslim Cuban Americans. And the Protestant movement in Cuba started after the Spanish-American War, when many Americans came to Cuba. In the last topic, I will talk about food. Cuban food is varied through rice, is stable and commonly served at lunch and dinner. And other common dishes are chicken and rice, steak, sandwich, pork, cassava root, etc. And a common one staple is the Cuban sandwich, which is built on Cuban bread and was created standardized among cigar workers who traveled between Cuba and Florida around the turn of the 20th century. Further, Cuban version of pizza contains bread, which is usually served in cheese topping and sauce, which is made with spices such as adobo and Goya onion. And for guapo and Goya onion, picadillo, ground beef that has been sauteed with tomato, green pepper, green olive, and garlic is another popular Cuban dish. It can be served with black bean and rice and a side of deep fry. And for picadillo, ground beef that has been sauteed with tomato, green pepper, green olive, and garlic is another popular Cuban dish. It can be served with black bean and rice and side of deep fry. And this is all of our presentation. Thank you for watching, and I hope you guys learn and gain more about the information of the Cuban immigration to the United States. Thank you.